Welcome to Take It from the Iron Woman. My name is Susanne Müller, your host and the Iron Woman. This podcast is about empowering yourself and others to make real changes in the world. You will hear from everyday, smart, sophisticated, hip people like you and me. Not everybody has to be an Iron Woman to impress the world. Together, we will learn from the sports and business leaders how you can become a more successful person as an entrepreneur or a leader. It's one step at a time, one day at a time. Take your steps now. Take your big steps now. Join me on this journey to success. Take it from the Iron Woman. Today we have a real special guest, Agnes Hirschi. I'm very honored to have Agnes here on our show. She will share her story, how she and her mother and Carl Lutz survived 2 months in the bomb shelter in Budapest during World War II. What's happening in your world today?
Today is the virus which dominates my everyday program. I had several events for March planned. And yesterday I had the last speech in a school, and now the schools are closed, all schools, universities. And the next 3 events, which were supposed to be in March, I won't have them, of course. They are all cancelled.
That's amazing.
It's like in wartime.
Well, actually, I just wanted to say this is very timely that we speak with Agnes. So maybe Agnes, tell us your story. How was it when you were born? And I know you were in Hungary in the Second World War. So tell us a little bit about your story, and then we'll ask the question, what can we learn from you today? But we want to start at the beginning.
I think I have to start with my birth, with my family. My parents were Hungarian Jews. And my father was a very wealthy man. We had a beautiful apartment near the parliament. We had a maid and we had everything. We could afford everything. My parents made journeys and everything. Then, of course, my father, who was a merchant and who had his own business, he was thinking of emigrating to Great Britain. As many of his colleagues did. When he saw the restrictions, when he saw the development with Hitler, he decided to emigrate. But he had his money in his office. He couldn't get it out. Anyway, he was an optimist. So he thought he will send my mother to London, so I will be a British subject, and that might be an advantage. And he was right. My mother was pregnant in the 8 months. She started to go to London, accompanied by a Hungarian doctor. And then my father came a little later, 10 days before my birth, and I was born there. And I had a British birth certificate, which said that I'm Elizabeth Agi Gross. My religion was Anglican. And then he couldn't decide to stay in London. He was too optimistic. He thought things will never get so bad as they do in other countries, what happens to the Jews in other countries. So after a month after my birth, they went back to Hungary. And then in the first years, I was born in 1938. A few months later, the World War broke out. But in Hungary, in the beginning, you didn't feel so much of the war, because Hungary was the last country which was on March 1944 only. So before that, life went on, and Carl Lutz was, Now, you wanted my story or the story of Carl Lutz? That's the question.
We want your story, but obviously...
I start with Carl Lutz, actually. Carl Lutz was born 1895 in Walzenhausen. She was the second youngest of 10 children. Father had a court, and his mother was a wonderful woman, also a Sunday school teacher. The family was very religious, and she helped also poor people, although they were poor themselves. And she became very soon a widow with all the 10 children. The mother was the big
role model, probably,
of Carl Lutz, because she was such a fantastic woman. As they were poor, Carl Lutz finished his apprenticeship in St. Margrethen with a textile factory. He decided to emigrate to the United States. Mm-hmm. He had no money, he didn't speak English, and he had no contacts. That was very courageous to do that. He might have a chance there to get his studies and to become somebody. He really wanted to achieve something. So first when he arrived in the States, he had to work hard physically in a factory for 5 years in Granite City. And then he earned money for his studies, Central Wesleyan College, where he tried to become a Methodist priest. But he thought that he was too shy and he couldn't talk to people, and he was afraid he couldn't become a priest. So then the next station in his life was George Washington. After the college, he went to George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Going to the university, he also started to work for the Swiss legation in Washington, in the consular department. Mm-hmm. And he did a very good job. So they after 1 or 2 years, they employed him. Really, it was just it was a summer job for him. And then they employed him, and he was even transferred to St. Louis and Philadelphia to the consulates.
So it seems like hard work is paying off. Like that's what we can learn from the old days. Hard work pays off. Yeah, good. Yeah.
So then after 20 years in the United States, that was in 1935, he would love to get back to Switzerland, but because he has spent most of his life, big part of his life in the United States, he became very American, but he was always homesick. He was hoping to get home, but he married a Swiss woman, Gertrude Fankhauser, who was also working for the Swiss consulate, 35. And after the marriage, he was transferred to Palestine. Palestine was very important for him because he was very religious and he enjoyed the landscape. He enjoyed the scenes with the camels, and in Palestine at that time was the land of the Bible for him. So the first years he enjoyed that. But then World War II broke out and he had to take over the interests of the Germans. He did a very good job, and that helped him later in Budapest when he dealt with the Germans. In January 1942, he and his wife were transferred to Budapest. Mm-hmm. And as I told you, at that time, Budapest, the life there was still quite normal for people. Mm-hmm. You could go to the theater, you could go have a coffee at the Danube River in a nice cafe, and you could go to the swimming pool and the thermal bath and everything. He made beautiful pictures of everything because he was a very gifted photographer, amateur photographer. Fortunately for us, because he left hundreds of photographs. But then for the Jews, life was also more or less normal. That it means that there were already restrictions. The restrictions at the university, the restrictions that they couldn't exercise some professions anymore. There were too many Jews in Hungary. The population, there were about 10% of the population was Jewish of Hungary before the war. There were 800,000 Jews. After the war, 130,000 were left over. Life changed completely for the Jews and for the whole population after the German invasion on March 1944. Especially for the Jews, it was terrible. They lost their rights. They had to wear the yellow star. They were no more allowed to go to the street just for 1 hour. They could not do any shopping anymore. They couldn't get enough food. There are many restrictions, and especially their goods were confiscated. Their telephones, radios, everything was taken away. It was really terrible for the Jews. And Carl Lutz was the head of the Department of Foreign Interests. He represented the interests of 14 countries in war, among them Great Britain and the United States. Palestine was under British mandate at that time, so emigration to Palestine was also one of his jobs. But he was sent to Hungary to rescue Jews, what he did later, but just emigration was even part of his job. And when the Nazis entered Hungary, he still had the right to send 7,800 Jews legally to Palestine. But of course, times were changed. The final solution became very important, and Eichmann came to Budapest, the man who was in charge of the final solution. Carl Lutz dealt with him and with the Hungarian authorities, and he could arrange that these 7,800 people were accorded to him, that he was allowed to take them under his protection, that they were foreseen for emigration to Palestine. But emigration was not possible anymore at that time because the borders were closed for Jews. Well, after the German invasion, hundreds of people came to stood on the street in front of the office of Carl Lutz, and their last hope was emigration to Palestine under the terrible circumstances. He was a religious man, and he felt that he had to do something for these people, and had to find a way which was in accordance with his job, because he was still an employee of the Swiss consul. So he had to find something in connection with emigration to Palestine. He found the solution. Jews who wanted to emigrate to Palestine would be taken under Swiss protection while waiting for the emigration. And always 1,000 people, the names of 1,000 people were inscribed in a collective passport, Swiss passport. They were registered. He saw that this wasn't enough, that tens of thousands of Jews needed help. And then he found a way to help them. Eichmann spoke of units, not of people. So he interpreted units as families, and thus he could increase the number of the people he took under protection by 5 or 6. So we think he rescued about 50,000 people.
Wow, that's amazing. So it shows that he had a big heart and that he wanted to help many people. That's really amazing.
Yes, and he risked his life and his career by doing this, because this was not in accordance with Swiss policy.
Sure. Yeah.
You can imagine, staff consisted of 15 people, and that was not enough, of course. He needed much more help to issue so many certificates and to have all these passports made. And the emigration was done in cooperation with the Palestine office.
Okay.
The British controlled emigration to Palestine. And so first he placed the Palestine office into the so-called glass house. And then he called it immigration office. also to the glass house. The glass house was a wonderful building, Bauhaus style built in the 30s. A spectacular white house, all the glass on the facade and inside colored glasses. It was the showroom of a glass manufacturer, Arthur Weiss, a Jew who was no more allowed to exercise his profession. So he rented this house, and about 150 people were working there day and night. And then also the Jewish organizations were placed into this house. And the glass house enjoyed diplomatic protection. It was like part of the legation, of the Swiss legation, and that was a big advantage. And these Jewish pioneers and Zionists, they helped enormously by getting all the necessary documents for the protective papers and for the passports and everything. They were enormous help, but on the other side, later on in fall, they started to print their own protective papers because so many people who couldn't get the legal ones, but that came much later. We are just in summer 44 now when these people were taken under protection, and Carl Lutz was also careful to number. When he increased the number to families, he took care that the numbers of the protective papers were also only from 1 to 7,800. And then he started in the hope that the Germans wouldn't discover what he did.
Wow. Tell us your story, how you endured those difficult times.
Because I was a British subject, and Carl Lutz was in charge of the interests of the British. My mother, after the German invasion, my mother decided we had to look for protection and go to see Carl Lutz. We lived very close to the American legation where Carl Lutz had his office. I was 6-year-old, and we had the chance that we could get quite easily to the office of Carl Lutz. My mother was a beautiful woman, 33 years old, and a real beautiful Hungarian woman. And Carl Lutz, he was empfänglich für Schönheit.
He was open to beauty, and I'm sure your mother and you were very beautiful at that time. You still are.
With a big lash in my hair, yes.
Oh, yeah.
He said, of course, he will do something for us, but maybe he would like to do more for us than just to give us a protective paper. And he asked my mother to come back in 2 weeks. He will speak with his wife and see what he can do.
Yeah.
And back after 2 weeks, he said that he would employ my mother as a housekeeper in his residence in Buda. His residence was the former British legation, a wonderful building in Buda with a view to the Danube and Parliament and everything. Had 50 rooms there. And we got a little apartment with my mother. In summer 1944, we moved there.
Wow, that's a nice story, right?
Wonderful. That was a chance because we were in safety. We were together with the Swiss. In the first time, life was more or less going on. At least for me as a child, I had no problems. There was another little boy of the son of the chauffeur who was playmate, and then, of course, in November the times changed. The bombardments were practically non-stop. In Buda, that was much worse than in Pest on the other side of the Danube. Buda, at the end of the war, Buda was completely in ruins because the Germans had their headquarters in Buda, and there was also a military hospital just next to our house, underneath our house. after Christmas, 1944, the bombardments were to an extent that we had to move to the bomb shelter. And we couldn't come up anymore. There were 30 people there, of them on mattresses. For me, two big chairs were put together. That was my bed. I was small. The Lutz family had beds, and the others were on mattresses, and light and food. Mm-hmm. It was okay, but then for the 30 people, after a certain time, we had to be very careful, and we had no daylight during hours and so on. We had because war lasted much longer than it was foreseen. We had to stay 2 months in the bomb shelter, and while we were in the bomb shelter, the house was hit by 20 bombs in January 1945, and it burned completely down. Mm-hmm. Came up on February 18th, it was all in ruins.
Uh-oh. And tell us about your birthday, because I think the last time when we met, you told me that story about your birthday, and we all know, like, kids, they like to have a special day, a cake, but how is it, Agnes, at 7 years old in the shelter? Heartwarming to hear that.
I will never forget my 7th birthday on January 3rd, 1945, in the bomb shelter. We were already permanently in the bomb shelter, and Carl Lutz had saved some cacao for me, so they made a sort of cacao with water and canned milk, and especially he had also saved a box of Nestrovit. These were little white chocolates with vitamins, and up to today it's something very special. This chocolate is something very special to me. He was really wonderful that he tried to do his best, and I will never forget this birthday.
A very special birthday. What an inspirational story. How was your birthday when you were 7? I'm sure you have many more questions for Agnes. You can find all the information of her interesting life in the show notes. Connect with her, ask more questions. In the next episode, we speak to her again in German, where she elaborates a little more. Do not forget, every Monday is Podcast Monday. Leave a comment, like our podcast. Thank you very much for chiming in.